It's kind of crazy. You always think about these big cyber attacks hitting like the big guys, the ones with all the data, right?
Yeah.
But what if I told you that even like a completely fake system, a digital ghost town, gets hammered with attacks? We're looking at this report today. 570,000 plus cyber attacks caught live. And it's pretty wild. It shows just how much activity hits a system that isn't even real. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a great one you pick out. It really shows you the scale of the problem.
Yeah.
The author, Okoma Somto, set up what's called a honeypot. And think of it like leaving out a fake wallet to see who tries to snatch it.
Yeah, perfect analogy.
Yeah, exactly. To see what kind of shady stuff even an empty digital space attracts.
Right, exactly. And this wasn't some high security vault or anything. It was a total decoy, like a welcome mat for cyber criminals. And what Okoma wanted to do with this, as they say in the report, is help security teams get smarter,
Yep.
Be more polite, right? But honestly, just seeing the sheer number of attacks is pretty eye-opening for anyone who wonders what's really going on in those dark corners of the internet.
Yeah.
And get this, all this activity, it happened in just 1 week.
Wow.
Between March 17th and the 26th.
In 1 week, over 570,000 cyber attacks hit this thing. Just incredible.
Yeah, and as we, dig into the specifics here, we'll see the report reveals some pretty surprising things about, where are these attacks coming from? What techniques are they using? And, why should you even care if you're just trying to, keep your home computer safe, right?
Right.
So, okay, first things first. How did they even build this digital trap, this honeypot?
Okay, so the foundation was Microsoft Azure, running Ubuntu 22.04 LTS. Pretty standard version of Linux, nothing too fancy there.
Mm.
But then, the clever bit, they used something called Teapot 24.04.1.
Teapot. Okay, now that sounds interesting. What is that exactly?
So Teapot, think of it as a special toolkit, right?
Yeah.
Lets you set up not just one, but several different kinds of honeypots. All at the same time.
Oh, okay, I see.
So instead of having one type of bait, it's like you have a whole buffet of traps designed to catch all sorts of different cyber pests.
Ah, that makes sense.
Gives you a much broader picture of what attackers are actually trying to do.
Gotcha. So it's like a sampler platter of digital vulnerabilities to see what gets the most attention.
Exactly.
Now, the report gets into the nitty-gritty of the Azure setup, mentioning a virtual machine called a MyTeapot in the Teapot Honeypot Resource Group, located in Canada Central. They used a standard D4's v3 with 128 gigabytes of storage. That's a pretty beefy setup for something that's, basically meant to be fake, right?
Yeah, well, it's enough to run the Teapot framework effectively.
Right.
And, collect a decent amount of data. But what's really key here are the security rules they put in place.
Okay, right.
SSH, which is you can think of it as a secure digital key.
Yeah.
It lets you remotely control the computer. That was allowed, but only from one specific IP address, probably Okoma's, so they could manage it. But get this, all other ports, like every single one, from 1 to 65535, both TCP and UDP traffic, all wide open for monitoring.
Yeah.
That's a really wide net to see what comes sniffing around.
Yeah, that's like leaving all the doors and windows unlocked, but having a million security cameras everywhere.
Exactly.
So before they even installed Teapot, they did a basic system update using that, the command line sudo apt update and then sudo apt upgrade hell.
Right.
Why is that step important even for a system that's, designed to be attacked? Doesn't really matter, right?
Well, even for a honeypot, it's just good practice to start with a clean slate.
Right, yeah.
Make sure you're not observing attacks that are just hitting some old vulnerability in the base system that's not really part of the experiment.
Or,
you want to see the tricks that the hackers are using on your bait, not random flaws in, the phishing line itself.
yeah, that makes sense, yeah. So then came the Teapot installation, which, it involved getting the software from GitHub, running the setup script. Sounds pretty straightforward. They chose Hive mode, set up the username and password for the web interface, and then a restart. This Hive mode, is that like a standard Teapot thing, or is that something special they did?
No, Hive mode is pretty standard. It's it automatically sets up a bunch of different pre-configured honeypots, all designed to work together, simulate different parts of a network.
Oh, I see.
It's a convenient way to get a broad overview of different attack types without having to manually configure each individual honeypot.
Gotcha. So, okay, the stage is set, the digital trap is armed, and now for the main event, the attacks. The report, the title itself promised over 570,000. What was the final nail-biting count?
Well, it's actually a bit higher, 578,000 total attacks recorded in that 1 week. And what's also pretty interesting is the number of unique engagements, 46,957. So while there was this huge flood of attacks, it wasn't always completely new attackers, right?
Right.
Some were probably coming back, trying again, or probing in different ways.
Yeah, testing the defenses, seeing what works. And the report points to one type of attack as being the most used, the most popular, so to speak. Which one took that dubious honor?
That would be brute force attacks. It's basically a digital battering ram, right?
Okay.
Attackers just try to guess usernames and passwords over and over, hoping they eventually stumble upon the right combination.
Right.
It's a pretty basic technique.
Yeah.
Surprisingly effective, especially against systems that are still using weak or like default login details.
Yeah, we'll definitely get back to those password attempts because, oh boy, I saw some real head scratchers in there. The report also mentions high-risk attacks and successful exploits. What do those numbers tell us?
Okay, so there were 160,560 attacks classified as high risk. This means, most likely, they triggered more serious security alerts. Maybe they were targeting known vulnerabilities or showing more aggressive behavior. And out of all those, 485 were considered successful exploits. Now, successful in the context of a honeypot, it probably means they managed to trigger a vulnerability or get some level of access to the fake system.
Right.
Which, of course, wouldn't translate to a full breach in a real protected network.
Right, yeah.
It's more about seeing what they could have done.
Yeah, seeing their capabilities, their techniques. And it seems SSH, that secure remote access we talked about, that was a big target, with 29,195 attacks specifically aimed at it. Really highlights how much attackers want that remote control right.
Absolutely. If they can get SSH access, it's like having a secret backdoor into the system. They can install malware, snoop around for more vulnerabilities, or even try to spread to other connected systems if this were a real network.
Right, it gives them a foothold, and then who knows where they can go from there. So when we step back and look at all this, over 500,000 attempts in just 1 week on a system that wasn't even holding anything valuable, it really drives home the scale of these automated threats just constantly scanning the internet. It's kind of unsettling, isn't it?
It is. It gives us a real-time view of how these attackers operate, the weaknesses they're looking for, and what they might be trying to achieve.
And speaking of attackers, let's talk about where these digital assaults were coming from. The report has a breakdown by geographical origin, almost like a league table of attacking countries. Who were the top players in this not-so-friendly competition?
Well, the top countries were pretty interesting. Leading the pack, actually, was the United States, with about 78,500 attacks. Following close behind were the Netherlands, with about 26,690, and the United Kingdom, with roughly 18,840. Romania also made a showing with around 7,850 attacks.
The U.S. being at the top, that's a bit of a surprise, isn't it? We usually hear about the U.S. being the target.
Right, and that's a good point. Just because the attacks are coming from computers in the U.S. doesn't mean the attackers themselves are in the U.S.
Right.
It's very likely that many computers in the U.S. have been compromised, part of what are called botnets. Networks of infected machines, basically, controlled by someone else, and those botnets are being used to launch attacks all over the world.
So it's like these compromised machines are zombies doing the bidding of someone far away.
Exactly.
And what other countries were up there in the rankings?
Well, we also saw a lot of activity coming from South Asia, Bangladesh with a considerable 65,880 attacks, China with around 50,020, and India with about 28,120. Australia and France were also on the list, with 20,720 and 17,760 attacks, respectively.
So Bangladesh, China, and India all up there. Does that line up with what we know about where cybercriminal activity tends to be, or is it more likely just, widespread botnet infections?
It could be both, to be honest. It might point to more cybercriminal operations being based in those areas, but like we talked about with the U.S., it could also just be tons of compromised devices being used in botnets, hiding the true origin of the attackers.
Right, makes sense.
It's hard to say for sure without more digging, but the sheer volume from these regions definitely needs a closer look. What it really shows you is that these cyber threats, they don't care about borders. Even if you're a small business in Canada, you could be getting hit by something coming from a compromised device in the U.S., Bangladesh, anywhere.
Yeah, it's a global problem, no doubt.
Absolutely.
Now, the report gives us a peek at the different honeypots they used and what each one was meant to catch. So let's talk about Honeytrap, Cowrie, and SentryPeer. What were their specialties?
Okay, so Honeytrap, that one was designed to mimic those everyday network services you find on a typical server. Made it really good at catching general network attacks. It logged any suspicious connection attempts, and even grab some of the malicious files attackers tried to upload. Then those files can be analyzed to see what they were trying to do.
So it's like Honeytrap was the general store, attracting all sorts of shady characters trying to break in.
Exactly.
Now, Cowrie, that's an interesting name. What was its thing?
Cowrie, it was all about emulating SSH and Telnet services. SSH, think of it like a secure phone line to remotely control a computer, while Telnet's the older, less secure version.
Right, got it.
The fact that these were big targets, it tells us attackers really want that remote control access. Cowrie was great at spotting brute force login attempts against these services, even recorded the commands attackers typed if they guessed a password. It's like having a hidden camera in their session.
Wow, that's really valuable to see what they do once they think they're in. And then there's SentryPeer. That sounds very specific.
Yeah, SentryPeer is all about VoIP, voice over IP, how phone calls are made over the internet these days. It was set up to detect VoIP fraud, basically, by watching for calls to weird or high-cost numbers.
Good.
Helps spot scams and unauthorized calls made through compromised systems.
So it's like each of these honeypots was a specialized sensor looking for different kinds of trouble.
Precisely. And by using this range of honeypots, they got a much more detailed picture of the threats out there.
Now let's get into who these attackers were, or at least what systems they were using. The report has a section on the operating systems, the digital fingerprints, so to speak. What did that tell us about their tools of choice?
Okay, so the vast majority of attacks, about 86%, look like they were coming from systems running Linux.
Okay.
But here's the thing. A lot of them claim to be running really old versions of the Linux kernel, some even going back to the 2.2.x and 3.x series.
Wow, ancient history.
It suggests that attackers like to use those lightweight automated systems, Could be anything from compromised embedded devices to old servers that haven't been updated in years and have been pulled into botnets.
Right. Fits with that whole botnet idea we were talking about earlier.
Exactly.
What about Windows? It's so common it must have shown up, right?
Oh yeah, Windows systems were responsible for a noticeable chunk of the attacks, about 14%.
Okay.
We saw a mix of those older NT-based systems, as well as newer stuff like Windows 7 and 8.
Still being used out there.
Definitely points to botnets as well, but maybe a wider range of devices like infected desktops and laptops.
Right. Makes sense. Now, the report mentions a pretty sneaky tactic used by some of those Linux attackers. They were stripping timestamps from their network traffic. Why would they do that?
Well, by removing the timestamps, they're trying to make it harder to track what they're doing to connect the dots. A lot of security tools rely on those timestamps to understand the sequence of events in an attack. Mm-hmm. Without them, it's way harder to figure out what happened, when, and who might be behind it.
It's like trying to solve a crime with no timeline. They're trying to cover their tracks.
Absolutely.
Now, what about Mac OS? It's often seen as more secure than Windows out of the box. Did it pop up much in the attacker's origins?
Nah, macOS was pretty rare in this data. Might mean it's not used as much in these big automated attacks.
Makes sense.
But it's worth remembering that targeted attacks against macOS, those definitely happen.
Right, of course.
So the takeaway here is both Linux and Windows are major sources of cyber threats, and attackers are always adapting to stay hidden no matter what platform they're using.
Always a cat and mouse game.
Exactly.
All right, let's talk about the timing of these attacks. Was there a pattern? Were these hackers working 9 to 5, or was it all over the place?
Well, there were definitely some interesting patterns. The busiest days were Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday, and most of the action happened between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. West Africa time.
Okay, so quite a wide window there. Was there a specific time within that was like the peak?
Yeah, the most intense period was between 9 a.m. and 12 p.m. West Africa time. That accounted for about 7.4% of all the attacks.
That's interesting. It lines up with, regular business hours in that part of the world.
Right. You'd think attacks would be more common during off hours when systems are less monitored. But this suggests maybe it's organized cybercrime working on a schedule, or maybe these automated attacks are programmed to hit during business hours to blend in with regular traffic.
To hide in plain sight.
Exactly.
That's kind of creepy.
It is. It shows the need for constant monitoring, not just when things are quiet.
Let's dig into what these attackers were trying to do. The report highlights a surge in reconnaissance and exploitation attempts between March 20th and 24th, peaking on March 23rd. What do you think was going on there?
Well, that peak on March 23rd with over 8,000 alerts, that was probably a concentrated burst of automated scanning.
Okay.
Like a digital reconnaissance mission, probing for open ports, known vulnerabilities, basically mapping out the defenses.
And it wasn't just looking around. There were attempts to gain higher level access to the system too, right?
Yeah, those privilege escalation attempts actually peaked a bit earlier on March 21st with over 3,500 alerts. So it's like first they scout for weaknesses, then they try to barge in through those weak points.
Makes sense. The report also talks about a lot of failed authentication attempts. What does that tell us?
That probably points to techniques like credential stuffing, where they try using stolen usernames and passwords from old data breaches, or brute force attacks, where they just try tons of password combinations.
Just throwing stuff at the wall and hoping something sticks.
Exactly. They're looking for accounts with weak or default credentials. Even if they weren't successful most of the time, they were persistent.
And the report gets into critical suricata alerts. Can you explain what suricata is and what kind of alerts it was flagging?
So suricata is like a digital security guard for network traffic. It analyzes what's going on and triggers alerts when it sees something suspicious. The fact that it flagged over 170,000 critical exploit attempts in 1 week, that's a lot. Shows how relentless these automated attacks are.
So what were some of the specific threats that triggered those alerts?
One of the big ones was the double pulsar backdoor, with over 31,000 attempts.
Double pulsar, that rings a bell.
Right. It's often associated with the Eternal Blue exploit, used in some big ransomware attacks a few years ago.
Oh, right, yeah.
The fact that attackers are still trying to use this means there's still a lot of systems out there that haven't been patched. Easy targets.
Unbelievable. It's like they're not even trying to be creative anymore.
Sometimes the old tricks still work. We also saw over 29,000 connection attempts from known bad IP addresses. Shows the importance of keeping those block lists up to date.
Right, keep the bad guys out.
Exactly. And then a bunch of RDP scans, attempts to bypass RDP authentication. Again, attackers really want that remote access.
It's a recurring theme.
Definitely. Other things Suricata flagged were those ICMP ping requests, Nmap scans, not attacks in themselves, but often used for reconnaissance.
They're scoping things out, seeing what's there.
Exactly. And then there were a lot of weird HTTP requests, probes using Python scripts, likely trying to find vulnerabilities in web applications.
So it's clear they're going after those common weak points: Windows file sharing, remote access, and web vulnerability.
Exactly. Those are the doors they're always trying to break down.
Now let's get to the password playbook section. This is always a bit of a facepalm moment. What were the most commonly tried passwords and usernames?
Oh, it's amazing and a bit sad. How many people still use terrible passwords?
Yeah.
The top one, 100234556, over 5,700 attempts.
You've got to be kidding me.
Then admin, password, ABC123, even just 1231234. It's a hall of shame for passwords.
It's just unbelievable. And the usernames, were they equally bad?
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay.
Root, the administrator account on many Linux systems, that was the most targeted, over 5,700 times. Then admin, user, Oracle, test, even default usernames like Ubuntu, Postgres, Guest, Ginx, and Docker.
So basically they're going after the easiest targets. Default accounts, passwords that a 5-year-old could guess.
Yep, and the fact they're targeting those specific usernames like Postgres, Oracle, all that, shows they're also looking for poorly secured database and web servers.
Right.
It's a good reminder for everyone. Choose strong, unique passwords, change any default credentials, and keep your systems updated.
It's cybersecurity 101, but clearly people need the reminder. The report then goes into Old Foes Still Dangerous, which is about CVE exploits. Can you quickly explain what a CVE is?
Sure. CVE stands for Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures. It's basically a big list of known security flaws in software. Each one gets a unique CVE number.
Gotcha.
And the fact that attackers are still using exploits for vulnerabilities that are decades old, it just shows how important it is to keep your software patched.
It's like leaving that broken window unfixed for years and wondering why you keep getting robbed.
Exactly. So some of those older CVEs that were still being used, we saw CVE 2002-000 REN 3 and CVE 2002-0001, both affecting older Microsoft IS and SQL Server.
Okay.
Even CVE 1999-0517, a NetBIOS vulnerability, was being tried. Yeah. Those are from the late 90s, early 2000s.
Wow, that's incredible.
And we saw newer ones too, like Log4Shell and that Microsoft Exchange Server vulnerability, though those had fewer attempts in this specific week.
Right, but the fact that Log4Shell is still being used at all is worrying, given how big of a deal it was. So the big takeaway here is keep your software updated, have a good system for patching things.
Absolutely. Attackers are constantly scanning for these weaknesses. They don't care how old they are.
So what can security teams learn from all this? The report gives some next steps for SOC teams. What are the actionable insights?
Okay, so the report says the key findings are those high volumes of brute force attacks, attempts to exploit known CVEs, and all that reconnaissance activity.
Right.
First, they say enhanced threat intelligence integration. Basically, use those up-to-date lists of bad actors, make sure your systems can recognize them.
Keep the bad guys out.
Exactly. Second, prioritize patch management. Don't let those old vulnerabilities stay open, especially those high-risk ones like Log4Shell.
Right. Stay on top of updates.
Then strengthen access controls, strong passwords, multi-factor authentication, all that good stuff.
Yeah, make it harder to get in.
And finally, refine incident response playbooks.
Okay, so have a plan for when, not if, something happens.
Right. Know how to contain the attack, get rid of the threat, investigate, and recover. They suggest automating some of those actions, doing simulated attacks to test your response, and making sure everyone knows their role.
And the report briefly outlines those phases of incident response.
Yeah.
Detection, containment, investigation, recovery. It seems like this Honeypot data really highlights which phases are most important given the types of attacks they saw.
Absolutely. Being able to quickly detect and respond to brute force attempts, exploitation of known vulnerabilities, and that early reconnaissance, those are critical.
So last thing, let's look at those attacker insights, specifically the top 10 attacking IPs. What can we learn from those?
Well, that table shows the most active attackers during that week. For each IP, the report lists the number of attempts, the likely threat associated with it, and what you should do about it.
Okay.
What's really helpful is that it often links to those threat intelligence sites, like Abuse IPDB, Virus Total, Cisco Talos. You can get more info on those IPs, like their history and location.
And looking at these top IPs, some were responsible for tens of thousands of attempts in just 1 week. What were they up to?
Oh, all sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
DDoS attacks, phishing, malware distribution, botnets, brute force attacks against SSH and RDP. Some were also doing port scanning, SQL injection attempts, even command and control activity, which means they were probably controlling other compromised systems.
Yikes, that's scary.
The report recommends blocking those IPs, watching for any connections to them, updating antivirus, using multi-factor authentication, and checking your network for any signs of compromise.
Good advice. And it's interesting that the likely origins of these top IPs, based on that threat intelligence data, were places like Iran, Vietnam, Egypt, really drives home the point that this is a global problem.
Absolutely. Attacks can come from anywhere.
So wrapping things up here, this deep dive into Okoma's Honeypot report has been, well, pretty eye-opening. What were the most surprising things for you?
Just the sheer volume of attacks on a system that wasn't even real, that was shocking. It shows you how much automated stuff is out there, constantly probing for weaknesses.
Yeah, it's like a never-ending assault.
And the fact that they're still using those old exploits, those weak passwords, it's just crazy.
It's both fascinating and terrifying at the same time. You know, it makes you think, if this fake system got this much attention, what about all the real systems out there with real data?
Exactly. And it just reinforces those basic security practices. Strong passwords, multi-factor authentication, keeping your software updated, those are so important.
Absolutely. Well, if you, the listener, have any questions about this report, anything you'd like to dig into further, feel free to reach out.
This kind of report, it's a goldmine of information. And the more we understand about these attacks, the better we can defend ourselves.
That's the goal. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, folks. It's a wild world out there, and we'll keep doing our best to keep you informed.
Absolutely. Stay safe out there.